Have you heard any current estimates, credible current estimates about the overall damage done at this point to the Russian energy sector?
Yeah, I don't have all the statistics memorized off my head, candidly, but it's getting better. I
Mm.
mean, there's widespread gas shortages in several regions in Russia. Russian energy revenues are projected in the current federal budget for next year to go down drastically. I believe the number that the relevant authority in Russia, they said it was going to go down from something like about 40% of Russia's federal budget to an estimated something like 20% of the Russian federal budget revenue, which is substantial. The key thing I want to communicate here is that while hitting Russia's energy is good and will ultimately degrade their ability to protract the war, it's not going to stop them from being able to conduct the war.
Mm.
Um, because this is the sort of thing which is not a critical vulnerability, but it's a dampener. So to end the
So what
war
will?
still.
I mean, if that's the case, let me. I'm sorry for interrupting, George, but if that's the case, then what will? And I realize this is a very tough question, but what will get them to stop?
So you got to invalidate Putin's theory of victory. Putin's theory of victory postulates that, look, his military is sloppy. It takes a lot of resources to wage the war, but he doesn't really care because he's got a concept of operations where, as long as they keep making small, Pyrrhic tactical victories, they can mount those over time, and they eventually compound into operational victories. And his theory is that that will, in time, compound to strategic victories. So we will argue that to actually end the war, you have to invalidate the theory of victory, which means you got to stop the Russian army dead in its tracks. You got to actually make it so that those small, tiny tactical victories aren't possible. And there are tactical and operational concept problems related to that, to how to actually stop the current tactics the Russians are using. But once they stop moving forward, Putin then has to shift his mind from how do I sustain this drive to okay, how do I now actually get out of this situation where I'm spending a lot but not getting anything out of it? Because right now he's
Okay.
getting what he wants out of it.
So is that, by implication, does that mean just the provision of more weapons systems? Because I mean, look, I don't see a scenario where there's NATO or EU boots on the ground assisting the Ukrainian military. Up to this point, with the exception of a handful of incursions, it's been mostly defensive efforts on the Ukrainian military's parts. Incredible efforts, but it's not as if they're, you know, sustaining a massive counteroffensive and pushing them back into Russia. So, if I mean, I look, I'm not disagreeing, right? I think Putin, is at the heart of all of this. This is his mess, right? There's no other responsible party, and yet, yeah, I'm just. I guess I'm asking you again one of those odd questions that doesn't really have a direct answer. But if that's the case, if you have to stop them in their tracks, then what's that look like?
I'll tell you what it looks like. It, Look, it's a multifaceted problem, but the big factor that we're concerned about now has to do with the operational planning on the Ukrainian side and the development of how to actually degrade tactical frontline forces. So, pardon me, I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds here, but we have to defeat the way that the Russians currently advance. And this is a problem that's not going to be solved exclusively by just giving them a bunch of more equipment, giving them a bunch more stuff. That is part of the solution, obviously. But the Ukrainians need to figure out how to actually degrade the Russians throughout their depth. So here's the current problem. Um, the tactics have evolved drastically. The current tactics are that Russians no longer do their mechanized assaults. So tanks and armored personnel carriers are very, very seldom used anymore in frontline combat. They're occasionally used in supporting roles, but basically the main mode for maneuver is 3 to 5 guys, less than a squad, mortalized, and then they do infiltration missions where they then attempt to penetrate weak spots in the line, get to a bunker or a trench line or a forested area where they can then dig, and then they try to hold it down. And so it's a series of essentially 3 to 5 guys trying to go through this very difficult drone contested frontline area. Now, here's the good news. when you're counting from the zero line, basically the Ukrainians reconnoiter and strike with extreme prejudice anything from the 0 to the 25-kilometer front line. And so, all your brigade headquarters and stuff is further in the rear than that. Battalion headquarters a little bit closer. But by the time you get within 25 clicks of the zero line, you are now in super tactical formation, which is you're mortalized into very, very small groups. And it's a very ineffective way to move forward. There's a requirement operationally to push that denial zone further. I would like it so that the Ukrainians can actually deny that safe zone where they can then organize and have their assembly areas in that like 25 to 100-kilometer zone. And that's actually doable. And it's funny because what we're really talking about here is intermediate range strike and intermediate fire operations to make it so that that Russian infantryman doesn't have to basically infiltrate 20 kilometers. He's got to infiltrate now 50 kilometers, 70 kilometers. And as an infantryman, that gets really, really hard. And that's where you start to invalidate the tactical ability to move forward. Here's the issue. The Ukrainians have to reconstitute their mid-range strike. They used to have it. They used to have the Bayraktar, the Turkish drone that was effective at the early parts of the war. In the second and first years of the war, they had the Gimlers from HIMARS systems, which used to also serve as targets in that range. But the HIMARS are ineffective now because of advancements in Russian electronic warfare. They've adapted. And so really what we have is a very, a developed Ukrainian strategic long-range strike campaign with their strikes against the oil infrastructure, an extremely lethal tactical strike capability within the 0 to 25-kilometer range, but then this intermediate range where the Russians are basically operating with impunity. And so the Ukrainians do need more instruments and tools to strike those things, but they also need to think and not be so myopic about simply squashing all the Russians in front of them in the tactical zone, but going into the depth, working it. And that requires having commanders that think about planning missions, that think about integrating the drone and strike capabilities and assets in order to degrade those things. It's kind of like, this is a very crude analogy and not perfect, but kind of like thinking about air-land battle doctrine, but then applying it to the land domain, but into the depth. And so that's sort of one of, I think, the operational planning and then technological problems that we're facing right now. And that's the issue.
What about manpower issues?
Manpower continues to be an issue. The Ukrainians are going to have to recruit more people in order to reconstitute their infantry forces. So I'm not going to poo-poo that. I mean, it is a problem. The Ukrainians have some very strange force generation policies and structures in place. The good news is that they do retain those men. I mean, they still have the ability to push them into service when the political decisions are made. I think there's some merit to the decision to necessarily maybe not hold it off, because the fact of the matter is if you're going to take a bunch of infantrymen now, I mean, how are you going to deploy them? Because all the infantry battalions don't have enough vehicles to properly protect them or service them. And the Ukrainians are able to basically keep the Russian advance to a literal foot pace with what they're currently rocking. And so if we're going to talk about reconstituting the infantry and building the infantry, there are good things that can happen. And I believe, the United States, financed by Europe, we just signed a deal to send them more Bradleys, which is great. So when you get more Bradleys, you can start getting more infantry. So these things depend on each other.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment, a really positive, nice, and kind comment. That would be appreciated. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our daily updates.